The sterile white walls of the hospital room bore silent witness to the heartbreak within. Emma lay motionless, her chest rising and falling only with the assistance of the ventilator. Machines beat rhythmically, filling the heavy silence. Sarah, her mother, sat beside her, gripping Emma's cold hand with desperate strength. Her eyes, red and swollen from endless tears, burned with exhaustion. The door creaked open. A nurse entered quietly, offering Sarah a sympathetic glance. "Mrs. Thompson, the doctor will be in shortly with an update." Sarah barely nodded, her gaze never leaving her daughter's pale face. Before we continue with this intriguing story, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Do not forget to turn on the notification bell for more. Thank you. Emma suffered from a traumatic brain injury, TBI, due to a severe car accident. The impact caused brain swelling and internal bleeding, which led to her falling into a coma for 6 months. Despite multiple surgeries and extensive medical intervention, her condition remained unstable for a long time, with doctors unsure if she would ever regain consciousness. A few moments later, the door opened again, but this time, it wasn't a nurse. Daniel Thompson stood hesitantly in the doorway, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his expensive coat. His jaw was set in an unreadable expression. It had been 6 months since he had walked out on them. Sarah's body stiffened as anger, pain, and disbelief clashed within her. She stood up slowly, her voice low but filled with venom. "Why are you here?" Daniel sighed. "Sarah, I heard what happened. He looked at Emma, his face momentarily softening. "I needed to see her." Sarah let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You needed to see her? You left, Daniel. She needed you then, and you disappeared. Now she's in a coma, and you suddenly care? I made mistakes, okay?" "No," Sarah cut him off. "Mistakes are forgetting an anniversary or being late to a recital. You abandoned us." Her voice cracked, but her stance remained firm. Sarah's coping with Daniel's abandonment was one of the most painful experiences of her life. Initially, she was overwhelmed by the weight of being the sole caregiver for Emma, navigating endless hospital stays, medical bills, and the emotional devastation of nearly losing her daughter. At first, Sarah fell into a deep depression, feeling betrayed and furious at Daniel for walking away when their family needed him most. However, she refused to break. She threw herself into Emma's care, working tirelessly to ensure she had the best medical treatment possible. Friends and extended family supported her, especially her own mother, Margaret. But there were many nights she cried alone, feeling the crushing loneliness of facing such a battle without the person who was supposed to be by her side. Despite her heartbreak, Sarah never gave up on Emma. She sat by her daughter's bedside every day, reading to her, playing her favorite music, and talking to her as if she were awake, hoping that somewhere deep inside, Emma could hear her voice and find her way back. Daniel stepped closer, hesitating before speaking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but please, let me be here. Let me make it right." Though the pain of Daniel's absence never fully left her, Sarah became stronger, more independent, and resilient. His leaving forced her to rebuild herself, and by the time he returned, she was no longer the same woman who had once depended on him. Sarah looked at him, searching for sincerity, but all she felt was a deep ache in her chest. "You don't get to walk in and fix things when it's convenient for you, Daniel." The tension in the room was suffocating. Just then, the doctor entered, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Thompson," he acknowledged. "There's something you both need to know about Emma's condition." Sarah turned away from Daniel, giving the doctor her full attention. "What is it?" The doctor sighed, glancing at Emma's motionless form. "Her brain activity is showing slight improvement. It's not much, but it's something. However, there's a bigger concern." Sarah's breath caught. "What concern?" "There's swelling in her brain that needs to be addressed soon. We need to make a decision about an experimental procedure." Sarah clenched her jaw, nodding. "I'll do whatever it takes." Daniel stepped forward. And I want to help. Sarah turned to him sharply. You don't get to decide anything. Not anymore. The doctor cleared his throat. I understand there's tension here, but this decision needs to be made soon. I'll give you both a moment. He left, leaving Sarah and Daniel in thick silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. Sarah, please. Let me at least help with the costs. Whatever this takes, I'll do it. Sarah swallowed hard, her pride and pain clashing with the fear of losing her daughter. She exhaled slowly, then nodded. Fine. But don't think for 1 second that money erases what you did. Daniel lowered his head. I know. The decision was made. Now, all they could do was hope. The waiting room felt suffocating. The clock on the wall ticked in slow, agonizing seconds. Daniel sat with his hands clasped together, his fingers interlocked so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Across from him, Margaret sat beside Sarah in the waiting room, holding her daughter's hand, whispering reassurances despite the unknown outcome. Margaret had come to support her daughter as she heard that her granddaughter was going in for surgery. Dr. Patel finally emerged, his face unreadable. She's stable, he announced. The room exhaled. The surgery was difficult, but she responded well. Now, we wait. Margaret let out a quiet sob, pressing Sarah's hand against her forehead. Thank you, doctor, she whispered. Daniel's shoulders slumped in relief, but his mind raced. Even if Emma survived, what would she think of him? Would she ever forgive him? Hours passed. The steady beeping of machines filled the air as Emma lay unconscious. Then, just as the sun began to rise, her fingers twitched. A faint, almost imperceptible movement. Sarah gasped. Emma, she whispered. Daniel shot up from his chair. Emma? Can you hear us? Emma's eyelids fluttered. Then, slowly, they opened. She blinked against the harsh hospital lights. Her lips parted, dry and cracked, as she tried to form words. Grandma, she said softly. Yes, I am here, my baby, Margaret whispered. Sarah leaned in, tears streaming down her face. Baby, you're okay. You're safe. Emma's gaze slowly shifted toward Daniel. A flicker of recognition passed through her tired eyes. Then, her expression darkened. Where were you? Her voice was hoarse but firm. The words cut through Daniel like a blade. Sarah glanced between them, hesitant. Sweetheart, now isn't the... No, Emma interrupted weakly, but her determination was clear. I need to know. Daniel swallowed hard. I was scared. Emma's brows furrowed. Scared? His voice was barely above a whisper. Scared of losing you. Scared of facing what I had already lost. I failed you once, Emma, and I didn't know if I could handle failing you again. Tears welled in Emma's eyes. So you left? Daniel's throat tightened. I thought if I stayed away, I wouldn't have to see you, his voice broke. See you like this. Emma inhaled sharply, her fingers clenching into the sheets. The pain of betrayal flashed across her face, but then, something softer emerged. She studied him for a long moment, seeing the raw regret in his eyes. I waited for you, she whispered. Daniel lowered his head, his body shaking. I know. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. Silence stretched between them. Then, Emma sighed, closing her eyes briefly before opening them again. You don't get to run anymore. Daniel nodded, a silent vow in his gaze. I won't. Sarah wiped her tears and squeezed Emma's hand. You need to rest, sweetheart. Emma's breathing slowed, exhaustion pulling her back into sleep. As Daniel watched his daughter, a newfound determination settled in his chest. This was his second chance. And he wouldn't waste it. An hour later, Margaret gathered things that needed to be taken home for new replacement. She left the hospital with great relief that her grandchild is now awake from coma. But just as Sarah and Daniel thought the worst was over, the door burst open. A nurse hurried in, her expression urgent. "There's a complication," she said. "We need to run more tests. Now." Sarah paled. Daniel's heart pounded. The nightmare wasn't over yet. The room turned ice cold. Sarah gripped Emma's hand tighter as Daniel shot up from his chair, his stomach twisting into knots. "What kind of complication?" Daniel demanded, his voice sharp with fear. Dr. Patel rushed in behind the nurse, his expression unreadable but his urgency unmistakable. "Emma's vitals have become unstable. We're seeing irregular activity in her brain scans. We need to act immediately." Sarah covered her mouth, trying to stifle a sob. But she just woke up, she was getting better. Dr. Patel gave her a sympathetic look. "We need to confirm what's causing the fluctuations. There could be swelling, or," he hesitated, "another clot." Daniel's heart nearly stopped. No, that's not possible. You said she was stable." "Sometimes, post-surgical complications develop unpredictably," the doctor explained. "We have to take her in now." Sarah hesitated only for a second before nodding. "Do whatever it takes. Just save my daughter." The room burst into motion. Nurses wheeled Emma's bed out as Daniel and Sarah followed, helpless, watching their daughter disappear through the double doors. The sterile white hallway seemed endless as they stopped just outside the surgical ward. Sarah sank into a chair, trembling. "I can't do this again. I can't lose her." Daniel sat beside her, his hands shaking as he reached for hers. It was the first time in years that he'd held her hand. The warmth of it grounded him. "She's strong," Daniel whispered. "Stronger than me, stronger than both of us. She's going to fight." Sarah squeezed his hand back, tears rolling down her cheeks. She shouldn't have to fight alone. For the first time in years, they were on the same side again. The minutes crawled by like hours. Daniel stood up, pacing back and forth, raking his fingers through his hair. The walls felt like they were closing in. He had never felt so powerless. Just then, the doors swung open. Dr. Patel emerged, his scrubs damp with sweat. Daniel and Sarah ran to him, searching his face for any clue, any sign of hope. Dr. Patel exhaled, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "She made it through. There was a minor clot forming, but we caught it just in time. The next 24 hours are critical, but I'm optimistic." Sarah broke down in sobs, her knees buckling as relief washed over her. Daniel caught her before she could fall, holding her close as emotion threatened to consume them both. "When can we see her?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse. "She's being moved back to her room now," Dr. Patel said. "She'll be in and out of consciousness for a while, but she's stable." They nodded, following as nurses wheeled Emma back into the room. Daniel stepped in first, hesitating at the sight of his daughter. She looked so small, so fragile against the hospital sheets. But she was alive. Sarah sat beside Emma, brushing a hand over her forehead. Daniel took a deep breath, then stepped closer. "Emma?" Her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, she turned her head, her gaze locking onto his. "You're still here," she whispered. Daniel felt his throat close up. He nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." A small, tired smile tugged at Emma's lips. "Good." As exhaustion pulled her back into sleep, Daniel looked at Sarah. For the first time in a long time, he murmured, "I feel like I belong here." Sarah steadied him, but did not forgive Daniel easily. His abandonment left deep emotional scars, and even now that he returned, she struggled to trust him again. While she eventually let go of her anger for the sake of Emma's well-being, true forgiveness was much harder to grant. She made it clear that his actions had consequences and that he had to earn back any place in their lives. Over time, Daniel showed genuine remorse and tried to make amends, but Sarah remained cautious. While she moved forward, she never forgot how he left when they needed him most. Emma continued to recover slowly but with determination. Was Sarah right to have remained cautious of Daniel, or should she have just forgiven him and moved on like nothing happened? Share your thoughts in the comment section. Also tell us where you are watching from. And if you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and hit the subscribe button. Do not forget to turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories.